Everybody, how are we feeling this morning? How are we feeling this morning? Yay! All right. So my name is Angie Byron. I go by WebChick on Twitter and Drupal.org and many other places except for Gmail. I don't know who WebChick at Gmail is, but she probably gets a lot of very confusing mails. She doesn't know what they mean. I'm here to talk about Drupal 9 because I enjoy scaring you at 9:45 in the morning, and backwards compatibility, and try and explain why now I think is the time to move to Drupal 8. So in the Drupal community, I wear many hats. For people who don't know me, I got my start in Drupal back in 2005 as a Google Summer of Code student. I worked on the quiz module, which was a module to let teachers do online education and things like that. That module is still around today, but thankfully contains none of my code, so it's safe. You should probably use it. I wrote a book once. Don't recommend that. I work at Ahui in the office of the CTO, so Dries is my boss. No pressure at all. And within the Drupal community, I am a Drupal core committer, which means I review other people's submissions and check them over for quality standards, performance, these kinds of things before accepting them into the software. And I'm also a Drupal product manager, which means that I help set roadmaps for Drupal, talk with the various initiative teams on what they have planned, look at what our competitors are doing and what we could be doing better, and all those kinds of things. So that's a little bit about me. But let's not talk about that because that's boring. Let's talk about Drupal. So can I get a show of hands? How many people here are in the what is a Drupal part of their learning curve? Okay, so everyone here knows what Drupal is and stuff. That's good, because sometimes that is a thing. How many people here would classify themselves as site builders? So they know how to click around in the interface, they do stuff in that nature, but they don't really dive into development too much. Okay, so a few people. Okay. How many people would classify themselves as front-end developers? So they're people working in CSS, JavaScript, all those kinds of things. Okay, quite a few more. All right. And then how about back-end developers? Everybody. Okay, great. Because this is a pretty nerdy talk, and it gets a little into the weeds, and so I just wanted to kind of suss out who my audience is so I don't need to spend a lot of time on things you already know. Okay, great. So, brief history of Drupal. This is for the what's a Drupal people in the audience, so you can sleep through this part. It'll be fine. Drupal is three things, I like to say. It's a very flexible framework. You can do basically anything with Drupal, from run a nice website that you have going. You can run a headless application that outputs things to mobile apps and kiosks in the mall, or runs a ticker on a TV station, or lots of different things that people do with Drupal. Kind of the power of Drupal is the structured content aspect of it. So you can create content types and structure your data in such a way that all the things that you capture are captured into little fields. The different data types like number, text, entity reference, which means you can refer from one type of data to another. That automatically generates a nice content entry form, so people don't need to use any code in order to get things into the CMS. And then on output, it will display it, and you have a lot of control over how that's displayed. There's the ability to turn fields on and off, to move them around, as well as the ability to do what's called theming, which makes it look very pretty and nice, as long as you have a good designer. My themes do not look pretty and nice, but when you enter content into Drupal, you can then output in a variety of ways. There's something called the views module, which lets you take all of the content you put into Drupal and output it in various different ways. So this is an example of a grid view. This is an example of a table view with little buttons to do bulk exports and this kind of stuff. Anything that you can think of as a list of content, whether it's a calendar or a bulleted list in the sidebar, anything like that, you can just click together with the views module without writing any code. So I would say that between those two things, that's kind of the most important functionality of Drupal that kind of differentiates it from its competitors. There's also a variety of what are called modules. So these are optional features that you can turn on. A core ships with about 100 of them, and then you can also get thousands more available from the Drupal community. So this would be things if you want to turn on, say 5-star ratings, or you want a wiki, or you want a shopping cart, or these kinds of things. You can go to the contributed section and download those things. So if you want to get started with Drupal, this is a relatively new addition. We have the Drupal 8 user guide, which is really great because it is translated into multiple languages. It is held in source code, so we can track make sure that everything in there is actually accurate and has been edited by somebody, which is pretty cool. So I recommend you check it out. Drupal also has this amazing community behind it. There are millions of users on Drupal.org. There are thousands of developers. There's all the people in rooms like this, a huge local community. So for example, in Drupal core, we have over 4,200 contributors that have contributed to Drupal 8. Across the different projects, we have over 100,000 users that are actively contributing. They are uploading patches, they're responding to support requests, they are doing various things like that to try to push the project forward. A large developer community doing 1,700 commits a week, and lots of chatter of people trying to solve problems or add new features, that kind of stuff. It's also a very global community. So we have events like this all over the world, in every single country around the world. This is just the stuff that's coming up a little bit later this year. So lots and lots of cool, awesome things. And what I really like about the Drupal community is not just the size and the scope of it, but the fact that despite the size and scope of it, we've managed to kind of keep this kernel of humility and respect for one another, where you go into other open source communities and sometimes it's a little bit of a hotshot kind of environment where it's like, oh, did you know that I wrote the breakfast.js library, haha, or whatever. It's like, because you can take any random noun and put JS after it, and I guarantee it's a library. But anyway.
It's a drinking game, too.
What's that?
It's a drinking game, too.
Is it really? Yeah, it totally is a drinking game, yeah. So basically, that's kind of some of the ethos in other communities. In our community, it's more like, do you not know of the blah blah module? Because it's amazing. Let me tell you all about how it works. And people just get so excited and they start sharing information, and it's just a really exciting community to be part of, and I hope you feel some of that at this event. How many people are here for the first time at this event? Are there any? Okay, quite a few of you. Great. So come to the party tonight. Apparently we'll be on a big gigantic Ferris wheel. That sounds pretty cool. But just talk to people in the hallways and mill about, because everyone is really friendly and super nice, and it'd be awesome to meet more of you. The third thing that Drupal strives to be for is on the cutting edge of technology. So Drupal has its roots in a project by developers for developers, which is why when we did the show of hands, everybody here is like a back-end developer for the most part. Drupal evolved from a developer being like, well, I need a better way to do a copyright message. So, let's figure that out. And then also, writing all this HTML for this content is really boring, and getting emails every time it needs to be updated. So it really came from the need of developers to kind of push off the kind of easy stuff so where the customer can do that themselves, and they can work on the really interesting parts, like how do I integrate these two systems, or how do I, really solve this complicated technical problem. Traditionally, that cutting edge of technology has come at the expense of backwards compatibility. So Drupal has this really bad reputation for basically forcing you to reinvent your entire site again every major release. So from 6 to 7 or from 7 to 8, it's not just like click a button and it's done. It's a kind of a major undertaking. It's like, especially if you have a lot of custom code, especially if you're not sticking to sort of established best practices, that kind of stuff. So we're working on changing that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. For those who are new to Drupal 8, Drupal's from a what it looks like perspective and how it works perspective is very similar to Drupal 7. You still got views, content types, all this kind of stuff, but a lot more functionality ships out of the box in core now, as well as new capabilities like HTML5 support, mobile friendliness out of the box, all this kind of stuff. So if you're used to using Drupal 7, these are some changes that you'll notice in Drupal 8. Multilingual is all in there and works without 30 contributed modules and stuff like that. It's pretty awesome. I asked on Twitter the other month, I guess now, what people's favorite part of Drupal 8 was, and kind of some themes sort of came up. One was they really liked the fact that Drupal was rewritten in modern object-oriented PHP. That's a very controversial statement, because a lot of people don't like that it was rewritten in modern object-oriented PHP, but for people who either already knew object-oriented programming from literally any other language, or for people who had been PHP developers for a while and moved to that paradigm, they really like that, because the code is very consistent. Each file does exactly one thing, so you go in there and you know what you're looking at. It's not 3,000 lines of functions that you have to try to sort through. It's also testable, so we've increased the test coverage, automated test coverage of Drupal 8 by like triple-fold or something. So we have many more tests ensuring that the product is stable and functioning. People also really like the new theming library in Drupal 8, which is called Twig. In Drupal 7 and below, we use something called PHP template, which was like mostly HTML, but then you'd have these little bits of PHP here and there, which was fine if you're a PHP developer, but if you're someone who knows CSS and HTML really well and doesn't know and doesn't want to know this old, a buggy and hoarse language from the 90s, it becomes kind of problematic. And so Twig is nice because it is all HTML and CSS with little, special brackety thingies. And then the complex logic, if there is any, is kept in the PHP file away from the template. So there's a really nice separation of logic and presentation. You can also do some really interesting things like inheritance. So you can set up most of how you want your template to look, inherit it from another template without duplicating a bunch of code. So people really like that. And then the third thing that came up was configuration management. So in Drupal 7, there's the features module, which is fine. It works for what it works, but it's not built into the core product. And so features and CTools and these other things have to sort of like cover different bases in contrib in sort of hopefully a consistent way, but not necessarily a consistent way. In Drupal 8, you're forced to think about the configuration system because the system doesn't work unless you've done that. And so every single setting on your site, every single what are called config entities, so things like content types, roles, this kind of stuff, is all baked into the system, and you can move them seamlessly from dev to stage to live and prepare things and this kind of thing. So this is another really big advantage that people love about Drupal 8. My personal one is the fact that you can now, for the first time in a long time, build an actual real Drupal site out of the box. So you don't need 30 contributed modules to build something like this. It's all included in what you need to do. Drupal 8 also has a nice maturing contrib ecosystem. Like I said, that traditional thing where you have to rebuild your site between versions is still the case from 7 to 8. So we had to kind of start from scratch again with all the modules. This number is now at 1,700 stable projects and 4,600 in development, so it keeps creeping on up there. With a lot of the new functionality in core as well, a lot of modules are no longer relevant because the stuff just works out of the box, so you don't need a lot of the same modules that you used to. Drupal 8 is now the go-to release for most agencies. Some agencies are only doing Drupal 8. That's the kind of majority of them. And most of them are doing kind of a mix of 7 and 8, but trying to aim towards the newest stuff because that's where most of the developer energy is in the community. So it's good to align your site building efforts with where the developers care, because then you have the biggest bang for your buck. There's numerous success stories, so lots of big organizations that you might have heard of using Drupal. My favorite one on this particular page is YMCA, because this is an organization that helps sort of underprivileged, at-risk youth. And they, by building all of their sort of local chapters off one platform, a Drupal 8 platform called OpenY, they're able to save untold hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in IT costs of every single office doing their own bespoke custom thing in a variety of different technologies. And then every single dollar that they save on IT costs, they pour right back into helping kids. So I think that is awesome that Drupal is able to facilitate stuff like that. So that's kind of an overview of Drupal, Drupal 8, where we're at. I want to now kind of segue into a history of Drupal release management to try and contextualize some of the stuff that we're doing nowadays to sort of modernize the release practices and that kind of thing. But before I segue into that, any questions on what you just saw? What's Drupal? We covered that, actually, yeah. Yeah. It's this thing. You might, it's kind of cool, I guess. I don't know, yeah. All right, so I'll talk about this a little bit. So traditionally, say, how many people are, okay, we could do that stand-up, I think, but I'm not going to make you stand up because that's just cruel to do to people before noon. But were people here in the 4.6, 4.7 days, a few of us? Yep, okay. So back then, we used to put out one release a year, and there would be a list this big of what you needed to change in your module that we had rewritten on you. 4.7 was kind of a bugger because we rewrote the entire way forms worked, but more or less it was like that. That went all the way from Drupal 4.6, 4.7, Drupal 5, and then and Drupal 6. However, between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7, the gap gets a lot longer, and between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, it gets longer still. So Drupal 6 to 7 was approximately a 3-year difference in time. Drupal 7 to 8 was about 4.5 years. And these were because we were trying to do big, important changes. Like in Drupal 7, we redesigned the admin UI to actually be an admin UI. We added the ability to do automated testing, a bunch of different things. In Drupal 8, we got even more ambitious, and we tried to solve things like, hey, people expect sites to work on mobile now. People expect modern HTML5 standards, this kind of stuff. They expect functionality out of the box. Web services are a thing, etc. So as we got more and more ambitious, the releases were taking longer and longer. And the problem with when it's done, is our previous release cycle, is that no one can plan around that. Core developers can't plan around that, so they don't know if I work on a feature in 2011, when are my customers going to see it? When are the people who care about this going to see it? Nobody knew. And that was really frustrating. It's also impossible to plan migrations around. If you don't know when the next version of the software is, how do you know what year to budget for a big site migration to move from 6 to 8 or 7 to 8, this kind of stuff. And because we only increased the feature set of Drupal when we did a major version increase, that meant that new features would come up for Drupal at a very random, odd, long stretch of times. So we're still shipping Drupal 7 with like the version of jQuery that was really cool in 2011, right? That's like fucking 6 years ago or something. We don't want to do that anymore. And then we'll break your code, not your data means that people will often stay on the old release until its end of life. People are probably still on Drupal 6, even though that end of life February of 2015. And then if they want to move off, they're faced with a painful upgrade path. And some people will look at that upgrade path and be like, well, since I have to rewrite my entire thing anyway, what's Squarespace doing? What's WordPress doing? They'll look at other technologies, which is fine, because if some other technology is better for what you need, that's great. But we don't want people to have to downgrade the limitations of their platform in order to avoid a painful upgrade path. So now we do it like this. So every 6 months, we ship a new, what's called a minor release of Drupal 8. So Drupal 8.0 came out in November of 2015, and then ever since then, we've had many, I've got some question marks where I shouldn't have question marks, because I gave this talk 2 weeks ago where those were question marks. But anyway, but yeah, so every 6 months we ship, and this is an opportunity to add new features, to add new APIs, to fix critical bugs, this kind of stuff, in between these major releases, so that you can plan for, there's going to be new, for example, layout capabilities that's coming in Drupal 8.5. Or in Drupal 8.3, we increase the version of CK editor. So you can plan for these kinds of things, and you know when they're coming down the pipe, so you can know, all right, the alpha release of whatever is going to come out here, that's when we're going to start a development environment, make sure everything's working properly, and then you don't need to wait some untold period of time in order to get new features. And the really great thing about all these new features is they're coming with backwards compatibility. So we no longer rewrite all the APIs and then say, good luck with that. Instead, we keep the existing APIs, mark them deprecated, and then give you new APIs and switch everything over to the better way of doing things. And then in the process of doing this, we're also introducing what are called long-term support releases, where we go to security fixes only. This is effectively where Drupal 7 is today. We're not adding new features to Drupal 7 on a regular basis. And so what we're going to do with Drupal 8 is keep putting out new Drupal 8 versions every 6 months until we run out of things to do, or until the amount of deprecated code becomes too much. And then we'll ship Drupal 9. But then Drupal 8 will at that point turn into a long-term support release. So you will still get, you won't get the 6-month release cycle, but this is perfect if you're an enterprise and you're like, I want to be on something, I want it to never change ever. That will be a great platform for you. And everyone else can switch to 9 and then be on the thing that's constantly getting new features. We've also changed up our innovation model a bit. So it wasn't like Drupal 7 didn't get new features, because it did get new features all the time, but it got new features through contributed modules, through the community contribution process, which is great and lovely, except that there are like thousands of those. And so if you want to try and find the one module that you need to do the best practice around the blah, whatever thing it is that you're trying to do, it was a painful process. You had to download a whole bunch of different approaches and try different things. Also, with this stuff not being built into core, the process of getting, for example, multilingual up and running involved 30 modules and configuring them just so, and this kind of stuff. So what we started doing is looking at, here are functionality and features we know we want in the core product, Drupal, but we also know they're not perfect yet. So we made this kind of experimental gray area of Drupal core, where we put stuff that we know we want as part of the core product, but we give them in kind of like a beta level stability, so you can try them out and give us feedback on how they work before we finalize them in the product itself. And so it goes through this process of starting at alpha and then beta and then stable. And so over time, all of these have moved from the alpha part of the chart here over to the stable version of the chart. And then we have a few things that are still in flight, as you can see. So the benefits of all of these changes are Now we have a predictable release cycle that both end users and core developers can plan around and organize. They can plan migrations around. They know when the deadlines are to get features in, and if it doesn't make it, they go to the next version, that sort of thing. Site builders get to constantly have a stream of new powerful functionality without reinventing their site. You know, when the new layout builder ships as a stable feature, you can use it if you want, but if what you've currently got on the go with layouts is working fine, you're fine. There's going to be no backwards compatibility breaks for you. We, as product managers, get the opportunity to get end user feedback without doing the thing we usually do in Drupal, which is like, we create a feature, we argue about it for 150 comments in issue number 12745, and then we're like, well, all the angry developers in 12745 thought it was a good idea, therefore we should ship it, you know. As opposed to like, wait, if this feature's for content authors, maybe we should let content authors try it and then tell us how it worked so that we can change it. So that's really, really great. And the big thing becomes that Drupal 9, when it does eventually ship, is just going to be one of these normal minor releases just with the backwards compatibility layers dropped. So as you can see, as we go forward, 8.4, 8.5, 8.6, etc., you know, we're adding this new capabilities, we're deprecating the old capabilities. Whatever that last version of Drupal 8 is, if you're building off of that, you're fine, because the 9 version, as long as all your stuff is up to date, is going to be quick and painless and not a problem. This is why getting on Drupal 8, when it's feasible for you to do so, is important, because this is going to mean that from now on, you don't have the painful eye-gouging, backwards compatibility breaking upgrades to do anymore. And you can upgrade to the latest version of those APIs at your leisure. You can do it at any point. You can do it every 6 months as they come out. You can wait until the last 8 release and do it then, or however you want to do it. It really what works best for your customers, your organization, that kind of stuff. But the point being that the last version of Drupal 8 will essentially be the same as Drupal 9, just with some backwards compatibility stuff. And as long as you're using the latest stuff of that, you can keep on rolling, which is pretty exciting. Usually when I talk about Drupal 9, people panic and they're like, oh my God, when is that going to be? So I don't know. Nobody knows. But this issue has the prerequisites. And there are quite a few. So I don't think it will be anytime soon, maybe a couple years. It might be with the release of Symfony 4 that we might have to do it. I'm not sure. But the point being that Drupal 9 needs a number of prerequisites. We need to make sure that there's no that crusty Drupal 7 code sticking around. We need to make sure we can do Drupal 8 to Drupal 8 migrations, because moving from 8 to 9 is going to require that. We have to make sure that modules can work in both Drupal 8 and 9 at the same time, because that will be a thing, and so on and so on. So there's various different things. If you want Drupal 9 to come out faster, that's the issue to work on. If you want it to go up slower, you can go in there and start throwing bombs. Just kidding, please don't do that. And anyway, but that's the main thing. Yes?
Quick question. So it sounds like everything will be pretty hunky-dory, smooth, going from 8 to 9. Does that mean that the database upgrade will also be just a hook update? Or
does that mean the database upgrade?
Database upgrade from 8 to 9.
Yeah, so this painful migration path, we've always managed the data migration. Like, we're never going to drop users or content or anything that you have. So that was always managed for you. In Drupal 7 and below, it was managed through update.php. So you'd run this update thing, which would make changes to your live site in a very harrowing manner. And usually your site would be down for 16 or 19 hours while all that happened. Really super fun. In Drupal 8, it's now a migration process. So instead, you build out your new site, you run the migration script, and then whenever you're ready, you flip the DNS over. But yeah, content is covered regardless. So that's not a policy we've ever changed. So your content will be brought over regardless if you're going from 6 to 8 or 7 to 8 or 8 to 9. That's always covered. It's been more the code that has been the huge problem, and the configuration that's been the huge problem.
So database will still have you have to run a migration as opposed to a hook update.
That I don't know yet. That's an interesting question, because we're not sure how that will shake out. Because in theory, it could just be update.php, right? Because we're not making major changes to the database, but it will kind of depend at that time. But we want to make sure that we have migration source and destination plugins for 8 to 8 anyway, because if you're starting from a very early version of Drupal 8 and you want to go to a very late version of Drupal 9, that might still be more straightforward than running update.php. So I don't know the answer to that particular question, like how the mechanisms will work, but we do want support for either option. But hopefully, in theory, it should just be an update.php kind of thing, because that's all you need to move from 8.4 to 8.5. So yeah, good question. Any other questions on this 8 to 9 transition, release management. Yes, hi.
Will the hook system be going away from 8 to 9?
So that's a great question. There are people who want, sorry, the question for those who didn't hear is, will the hook system be going away from 8 to 9? I don't know. Right now we have a weird situation where there are hooks and there are events, and they both kind of do the same thing, which is when a thing happens, I want you to trigger some code to execute over here. And that is a really weird situation to be in. So what I could anticipate happening between 8 and 9 is we got to pick one of those things. Either we're going to do hooks or we're going to do events. And if we do hooks, I could see us saying we need to make it object-oriented so that it's consistent with the rest of the system. And I don't actually know how we would go about doing that. So that's a little bit of a murky area. I would like to see us experiment with that in 8, actually, like maybe an experimental module that's like event hook or something like that, so that we could try and get the lay of how that would work. But I don't anticipate Drupal 9. It's a very weird situation in Drupal 8 right now, because if you show a Drupal 8 module to like a typical PHP object-oriented developer, they're going through and they're like, oh, this makes total sense. This makes sense. What the heck is this? And you show them like there are these magically named functions, and if the first part of the name matches your module name and the last part of the name matches this arbitrary string that's over in the code, then magic happens. You know what I mean? It's like, it's very confusing for people. So I think people who grew up on Drupal forget, because it's easy if you grew up on Drupal, but if you didn't, that is a really weird concept. I remember coming to Drupal and almost failing out of Google Summer of Code because I could not wrap my head around that at all, because I was like a Java, .NET kind of person.
It's very much a Drupal specific.
It is, yeah. So it's a fair question. I don't think that's on the list of these prerequisites. Is that what we're looking at? Yeah. I don't think it's specifically on that list of prerequisites, but it's definitely a pain point that we should look at seriously. What it tends to be is anything that's more of a registration kind of thing. So if it's what you typically would use, like, say, hook entity info or hook block info, a lot of that has moved to YAML or annotations or something like that, so we kind of have a particular way of doing those. A lot of the ones that are more like event-based triggers have moved to events. So all the migration system stuff is run off Symfony events. So like pre-import, post-import, all that kind of stuff. So what it might be is a holistic look at what hooks remain and moving them to one of those other systems so the system is more consistent. But there's no one that I know of actively working on that right now, so we'll have to see how that shakes out. Good question, though. Yeah. Yes?
Will we be going over any of this in the sprints tomorrow, by chance?
I can.
I would like to talk about it.
Sure. I can throw a copy of this at you if you...
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Okay, no problem. I love sprints. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide because I think I only have till 10:30 or something. So this is a whole section on putting all of this stuff into practice. So this is like, if you are a Drupal 8 site builder, here's some important links you ought to know and some definitions you ought to know, because even, like, I work for Acquia, and that's a big, Drupal company that ideally, knows all the things about Drupal. But even within Acquia, some people don't necessarily get all these messages because they come through random channels and this kind of stuff. So I just want to make sure. These are things I've seen very competent people who know what they're doing not know about some of this stuff. And so I want to try and, make sure everyone knows. So the first thing is to know the release schedule. So there's this URL, and this takes you to a page that documents, here's the next release cycle, or here's the current release cycle, here's the release cycle after that. And it's got all the important dates that you need to know about. As a site builder, I think you should pay particular attention to an alpha release date. Alpha release date means we're getting ready to ship that version of Drupal. And so you do not want to run an alpha on production. Don't do that. But it's a great time to set up a development environment, get the alpha version running with your site, and see if any problems shake out. Because if we catch them there, we have about 2 months to fix them before anything ships. And that's the optimal time to figure it out. A very unoptimal time to figure it out is after release, when all of a sudden we find out that this thing blew up every site using the taxonomy manager module or something like that. So testing early and often is very much appreciated. Alpha is also the cutoff for new features. So that's like our code freeze. So if anybody was working on stuff and it's in flight, it's supposed to have been in core by alpha. Now, sometimes we have people working on really amazing, awesome features, and we're like, oh, but it's so close. And then there's this really awkward dance where the product managers are like, please, 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 please. And the release managers are like, no, 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 no. And then like we have a big fight, and there's like a whole thing. But anyway, so sometimes between alpha and beta, we get a few more features. So that's just something to watch for. But usually by alpha, 90% of whatever's going to ship in that release is done. So that's a good stopping point to kind of check in and see how things are going. The other date to really pay attention to here is that when the version of Drupal comes out, in this case Drupal 8.5, the support for the previous version drops immediately. You won't get a security release for that version until approximately 3 weeks later, but you need to know that it's not okay to stay on Drupal 8.1.0 forever, because as soon as 8.2.0 comes out, we no longer support 8.1.0 and so on. This was a compromise with the security teams because they didn't want to have to maintain 18 branches of core at the same time for security release purposes. So that's the current model, is when 8.5.0 drops, 8.4.0 end of life. And then after the first security release of 8.5.0, if there was a security problem that only affected 8.4.0 for some reason, that would go in the public queue and we would discuss it and whether or not to backport it and that kind of stuff. So just FYI, because a lot of people don't know that and that can get you into trouble. Here's that in the graphical form. So we have a period of development, an alpha, beta, and RC that are each about 2 weeks long. And then we do the supported release, which ends the minute the other supported release comes out. These are the next Drupal 8s coming soon to a site near you. So there's Drupal 8.5, which is coming out March 7th, then Drupal 8.6 ships September 5th, and we also know the release date of Drupal 8.7, which will be March 6, 2019. That's an important date to remember because that's also when we drop support for PHP 5. PHP is dropping support for PHP 5 in December of this year. We're giving an extra couple of months to give people time to move off. And if you install Drupal 8.5 and you're on PHP 5, you'll see a warning in the installer that's like, hey, you might want to think about PHP 7. Also because PHP 7 is awesome and faster and many different advantages, but just pointing that out. Now, I said this is the way this currently works. The proposal right now, which could really use feedback from a variety of people, which is to do 3 releases a year instead of 2. Because, yes?
I was wondering, as a core committer, core maintainer, has had a fixed schedule made it easier on you or harder?
Oh my God, it's so much easier. Well, okay, it's easier and it's harder. Let's go back to this for a second. It's a good question. So it's really funny. Okay, so what happens each of these points when development ends and alpha gets frozen is there's this panic and there's this, oh my God, but I work so hard, and oh, but they work so hard, and that conflict happening more times a year doesn't really thrill me or anything. But the fact that that's our worst problem now is so awesome, because it used to be like, God, we've got 200 critical bugs to fix. We have no idea when we'll see the end of it. And I don't know when Drupal 8's shipping. And there were betting pools, and it was like a whole thing. So, like, this is a great problem to have. This problem where it's like, you know when the deadline is. You didn't get your stuff ready in time. Now we have to have a discussion, as opposed to like, well, good job. See you in 4 years. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of stuff. So I'd say that for the most part, predictable releases has been a godsend. And also the fact that as soon as alpha gets cut, development for the next version opens. So we really never close for features, which is also helpful. So people who are working on stuff and it doesn't get ready in time, it's like, no problem. You just work on it for 8.6 now, you know. It's just the
worst case scenario, if they're almost done, it gets in the next release.
Exactly, yeah. Yep. So out of the box is an example of an initiative that did not make the alpha deadline. We did commit their stuff to 8.6, and then the conversation was like, well, can we please, but it's so cool, could we just get it into, you know what I mean? It's like that kind of stuff is more what happened. So I would say, like, the grand scheme of problems, this has solved so many things, and I'm very grateful for it. It's just, you know, I don't know. It's just, from a product management perspective, you really want each release to have something compelling and awesome in it. And if we're too strictly adhering to deadlines and not acknowledging the fact that Drupal is a volunteer-driven community, like there's not, for the most part, there are no companies actively just working on core all the time. There's Acquia, there's Pfizer, there's a handful of other ones, but for the most part, that's no one's job. You know, things come about because someone had an itch to scratch or because their customer paid them to do it or whatever. But there's no like development team for Drupal that's all aligned and having sprints and things like this. Like there's just a random collection of people. So I like to be a little flexible on that myself. But yeah, that has been a godsend for sure. This is a new proposal we're talking about doing. We're not actually pursuing it actively right now, but it's currently in discussion, which would move us to 3 releases a year. And instead of dropping support immediately upon release of the next version of software, we would drop support 2 versions after. So that gives people more like an 8-month window to upgrade their site rather than a 6-month window to upgrade their site. So we're hoping that will help. It also means that those panic deadlines means you're not waiting 9 months to get your feature in core and out in production. You're now waiting 6 months. So we're hoping that would take some of the pressure off various people. But there's a lot of pros and cons to this thing. And we have an issue open here to collect feedback and discussion. So if people have thoughts on that, particularly from I build real sites in the wild, and this is what my customers would think of that perspective, we would really love to say that. Okay, so that's a lot about release timing and such. Another good thing to do is to keep up to date on what's coming down the pipe. So we have this page, which is anything API related, so library updates, a new API we added, some capability we had to change because of a critical issue, something like that. These will all get posted here. This is kind of a fire hose of information. So you may or may not want to subscribe to this thing. There's a Twitter account you can subscribe to. You may want to instead, or in addition to, subscribe to this thing, which is groups.drupal.org core. This is where we'll output any kind of important announcements like we're dropping support for PHP 5, or we are putting out a new release candidate next week, or whatever it is. This is a low volume way to keep up to date on kind of the major changes coming down the pipe. Another really important thing is when we say backwards compatibility, to understand what that means. It does not mean we'll never break anything ever. It means we will never break anything that's adhering to best practices ever. So, for example, if you have code that directly queries the name of a database table or a database column or something like that, rather than going through the database abstraction layer, or rather than using the entity field query system, that could break. Because we don't consider field and column names. We consider that an internal implementation detail to us. But we should never break the node save functionality. That's a solid API that you can build from, and that won't have changes that break backwards compatibility. So it's good to read through that and know especially where your code overlaps with that. Anytime there's a gotcha, like for example in Drupal 8.4, there was a gotcha where, oh boy, it was Drush people didn't want to support Drush 8 anymore, but Drush 9 wasn't really ready yet, and Drush 9 required Composer, and not everyone was using Composer. It just was a whole thing. Anyway, all of that kind of stuff will be in the release notes, and they spend an inordinate amount of time on making these release notes, so please read them, because anything in there is really good information for you to know, because you can find out well in advance of moving your site over what issues you're going to hit, what the workarounds are, that kind of stuff. I'd also recommend staying up to date on what's coming down the pipe from a roadmap perspective. Right now, right at this moment, the roadmap is in a total train wreck situation because I'm in the process of talking to, so maybe click that link in 2 weeks. But anyway, but there's a bunch of different initiatives that we have on the go for Drupal 8, trying to add more capabilities, trying to improve the underlying APIs, and it's good to be on top of what each of those are. So what's coming down the pipe? Drupal 8.5.0, we moved the content moderation and settings tray modules to stable, which is great. Those were experimental before. We've also added a new experimental module, which is Layout Builder, and I'm so stoked for it. I have a little video if you will indulge me. The Emami Demo profile, that was all the screenshots of the beautiful recipe website. So now Drupal 8 ships with a actual sample thing that shows you what Drupal's supposed to do. Because normally when you sell Drupal, you get an ugly blog that yells at you for not having content yet. Okay, so this is actually a full functioning Drupal website with entity references, views, taxonomy terms, all the things to kind of show off what Drupal can do. So that's in 8.5. It's currently hidden because we still want to do a little bit more QA on it before we expose it. It will definitely ship in 8.6, but we're still kind of on that fence of whether we can get it in. BigPipe, which is a great performance capability, which basically renders the content of your page before worrying about the sidebar, so your users get a lot faster response. That's now enabled in the standard profile out of the box, which is great. We've added support for video and audio tags from a media perspective. We've updated a bunch of libraries, a bunch of REST API improvements, etc. 2 tags that are really good to keep on top of are 8.5.0 release notes. That's anything that is like a gotcha situation. And 8.5.0 highlights are things that we're really proud about and we want to brag about in the releases. So if you want to care about those now, before all that stuff gets drafted, that's the place to go. I just want to play quick this video about the new layout builder. So this is the out-of-the-box Emami demo profile. So here they created a magazine, which is just a blank basic page. Click the layout button, and then you have the ability to add sections to your website. And each section can have 1 column, 2 column, or a variety of different things that you can choose from. And then within a section, you can add 1 or more blocks. So here they're going to add like a little header. Eventually, here we go. This is using the settings tray module, which I talked about earlier. So there, we got this nice little preview of what that's going to look like. We can add multiple sections down below that. So maybe we want to add a 2-column section underneath that because we want the first part to be like an overarching thing. And then you can start adding more blocks. There's support for drag and drop between the different regions and stuff like that. So this is experimental, right? It's still beta. So just FYI, we don't recommend this on a production website necessarily, but you know, it's pretty cool. And this is the kind of stuff that we really wanted to get into Drupal 8.0, and it's just a little bit after that. But hey, we're starting to see the fruits of that. And yeah, so I'm pretty freaking stoked about this. What do you guys think? Yeah! Draggy, droppy, etc. All right. I have a rundown of like each of the major initiatives and where they're at and all that kind of stuff. I think we don't have time for that. But basically all the initiatives are working really hard on making stuff happen. I wanted to emphasize these things don't happen without help, so please come to the sprints. A lot of people think I'm not a coder, so I can't help. I just want to point out there are like bazillions of ways to help that have nothing to do with writing a line of code. Accessibility testing, usability testing. If you have IE, that's a huge contribution because most of us are on Macs and stuff. If you're still on Drupal 7 and you're very sad about all of this, it's okay. You are fine until Drupal 9. And as we mentioned, we don't know when Drupal 9 will come out, but it'll be a while from now, so you're still good. But if Drupal 8 has features that you want, or you know, some of like say the config management system, the theming system is going to make your life a lot easier, I would recommend moving as soon as you can because it's going to set you up really well for future Drupal awesomeness. So you can monitor whatever contributed modules you need at the Contrib Tracker project that has like an issue representing each of the modules, at least that someone cared enough to make an issue about. And this is tracking like where to find the code, how to reach out to the maintainer to, you know, if they're looking for funding or if they're looking for co-maintainers or what the problem is with not getting their module ready by now. So that's really good. Testing out the migration path is also really welcome. Drupal 8.5.0 ships with a stable migrate API. Migrate Drupal and migrate UI are still beta, so they're not quite ready yet. But the only reason for that is because international websites, so anything using multilingual capabilities, still has one really hairy issue we haven't figured out yet. So we don't want to mark it stable, but if you're not a multilingual website, then effectively it works great. And you can use either the UI or Drush, whatever that you want. So in closing, don't delay. Try Drupal 8 today. So I don't know if we have a room monitor in here, but I think it ends at 10:30. Is that correct? Okay, maybe I'll take like 1 question, 2 questions. We were taking them a little bit throughout, so maybe that's okay. But yes.
So the roadmap documentation and all the communication through D.O and that you guys are doing just reviewed, I think is incredibly powerful. And a lot of times when I'm talking to organizations that are either looking to double down on their investment in Drupal as a technology, or maybe they're considering Drupal and comparing it to other enterprise CMSs, and we can show them that roadmap and kind of tell the story of the value of an open source project that is well supported as Drupal is.
Wow.
It really turns a light on it for them. But it feels like something that's still pretty raw, and I'm wondering like what the perception of the strategic value of the roadmap is, and the roadmap in the organization you guys are doing is for you, or maybe Aqua.
Yeah, so his statement was that the roadmap is helpful. I can show you the roadmap real quick. It's helpful to communicate to prospective customers that, you know, this community is thinking about things and they have plans around different stuff or whatever, but that it's still pretty raw, which is very factually accurate. We had no roadmap. It was a very controversial thing to even make this page. Like, I kind of burned some karma, like putting this URL on the internet. Seriously. But I felt like it was important because the core developer team has a lot of insight into what various people are working on, what's high priority, what low priority, and it felt wrong to not give that perspective and visibility to everyone else in the community, so they could better understand like why did this thing get prioritized over that thing, or like this kind of stuff. So, so I would say that I am very open to ideas on how to make this more like understandable for that audience, or maybe how to promote this page more.
Well, and to be clear, I wasn't trying to be critical
Yeah.
as much as to say I'm wondering if it's, I guess I was curious if it was a tool for the organization of the technical streams on that side, and if you all realize how powerful it is when you're communicating to people outside of the Drupal community, what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how the magic works. And
I think we don't know that, so hearing that is really beneficial. Thank you, because I mostly just get yelled at by people with like, why isn't that done yet, and what none of it. So thank you, I really appreciate it.
okay, yeah, you should do that. No, I mean, that's an area that you can focus on.
Yeah. But thank you. That's awesome feedback. Because that's the intent, right? You throw this stuff out there because you want people to be able to have those conversations with customers and be like, no, Drupal actually has thought about the end of their nose and they know where things are going. So so that's excellent that translates. But yeah, if you have feedback on how to make it better, please talk to me, Molly, and then I think we'll have to cut it off.
So kind of now moving to this minor releases every 6 months. I know that that's very different from the way we were working previously. And so could you talk a little bit about, like, for an organization who's just got a new Drupal 8 site, they've launched it on Drupal 5, right? What should they be ready for as far as workflow to prep for that 0.6 release, as far as getting ready?
Yep, I think one of the best ways to prep for these things is to have, the best is to have some like lightweight Selenium tests or something like that on any key functionality that tests through clicking, user registration, billing, whatever, and make sure that still functions. Because that's the critical things you want to make sure work. And if you have that, then all it is set up a dev environment, pull down 8.6, run the tests. They broke. What happened? Okay, If you don't have that, then it's the same process, but it's a lot of manual clicking around to try to make sure everything works and there's no gotchas. But that's definitely something I'm trying to push, both with end user customers as well as Acquia and other people. Anytime you have to integrate multiple systems, because core is very well tested against itself, but it's not well tested against Drush, and it's not well tested against Drupal console or any other things that you use. I'm trying to work on that as well. But at the moment, all of these products are tested in isolation. So if you as an end user are integrating a lot of these different things and a lot of different contrib modules and stuff, it's really helpful for you to have some basic automated coverage for that as well. And this doesn't need to be like the nut bars 100,000 unit test that Drupal core has, because that's already done. It's really focusing on the capabilities that's important to your site, that if this went down, we would lose money. Anything like that, I would say try to get that tested in some way, and then spin up 8.6 on a development environment at alpha, at beta, RC, and make sure everything's copacetic. That's pretty well it, because for the most part, if you look at these changes that happen between versions, we bend over backwards to make sure they don't break any code. So if it does break code, it's because it slipped through the cracks and we didn't know about it. That's why we want the early testing. So you should be able to leave your site at whatever version of code. If you're on 8.5, that version of code should be fine until Drupal 10 if you want. But ideally that would kind of get upgraded intermittently. So when Drupal 9 ships, and that's where we're doing new features, you can benefit from that relatively pain-free. So does that help at all? Or?
So but you don't necessarily have to upgrade every 6 months.
You do have to upgrade every 6 months.
You do have to. Okay.
You do, yeah, currently. Unless we do that every 4-month policy, and then it'd be every 8 months. But yes, you definitely do. When that new version of Drupal 8.n+1 is in alpha, you should pull it down and start testing it as soon as you can. Yep. Yeah, I said one more question and I keep talking. You guys can feel free to leave if you'd like.
So in August last year, the company launched its first Drupal site, and it's been great. But one thing that we've had issues with is figuring out how we can automate the clicks, right?
Yep.
So you have to spend money and resources on test coverage or whatever. So if you had to pick between running test coverage or some type of automated like we have solution, which one would you rather do, which will help long term?
Mm-hmm. So the statement was, given you have to upgrade every 6 months and you have to do some kind of testing for that regardless, which is painful, where would I invest the money in the testing? And you mentioned Behat, and Behat is fantastic. For those who don't know Behat, I'm going to get the URL wrong. I got it, yes. Oh, Really? You don't want to see this cool thing? Okay. Sorry. All right. Oh, right. It's over here. Gather windows. There we go. That'll work a lot better. This is how behat testing works. So you write the behavior you expect in English. It's like computer syntax, but it approximates English. And then the testing code behind it supports that the English does what it does. This is really powerful because you can hand writing these little descriptions of how features ought to work to totally non-technical people in your organization who are the people who are going to yell at you if it's not working the way they want. And it forces them to actually think through the logic of what they want. And they might realize through doing so that it makes absolutely no sense that there's a page curl on this page, that, or whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. So this is definitely a really great area to focus on. I think, though, the main one is not to get too wrapped up in what technology or this kind of thing, but more to like really hone in on the use cases. Because, yeah, testing can get expensive. You can spend anywhere from $0 to millions of dollars on test coverage. One of the sites I used to maintain when I worked at Lullabot was a membership site for the Grammys. And they had very complex logic for all kinds of different things. And if you were coming from this country or that country, whatever. So writing test coverage for all of that would have doubled the cost of the project. So instead we focused on which of these things, if they don't work, are going to cause you immense pain and harm or financially impact your organization, and we tested those things. And we did do it with automation, so we made it so that every time we committed something on a pre-commit, it would run the test and make sure that things weren't blowing up, because if they were, it wouldn't even let us push the change out. So that kind of is the sort of gate. But even if you have Selenium tests, you know, that just do a macro and click things and you run it in your browser manually, anything is better than just manual clicking, because that is like a recipe for carpal tunnel and frustration, and it's totally error prone, right? It's like if your test plan is like written on a napkin and you lose the napkin, you're SOL. So yeah, so that would be my recommendation. But yeah, behat is an excellent approach because it gets the business people involved in the success of their own site. So yeah, anyway. All right, thank you, everybody.